Alright guys, welcome back. We're up to topic 7.3, and this is all going to be about the Spanish-American War, the causes and effects of this short war. And in our last video, we talked all about what imperialism is. We looked at some motivations behind imperialism and also some people who are very much opposed to imperialism. Now, let's get into the topic of the Spanish-American War by going south of America, just a little bit, about 90 miles south of America, to Cuba. And Cuba was one of the original Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere, going back to the days, basically, of Columbus. And by the late 1800s, the Cubans were interested in having independence. They don't want to be part of the Spanish Empire any longer. And a rebellion breaks out. It's called the 10-Year War. And it was, again, a major revolt, and Americans were concerned because, again, Cuba is very close to America, but also Americans had invested heavily in Cuba, and war is not good for investments. So Americans, they feel a kinship with Cubans because they kind of see Cubans doing what Americans had done against the British in the 1770s, and they're also, again, concerned about the lack of money that they might be making on any type of rebellion going on in Cuba. So they want to keep Cuba calm. Now, to put down this rebellion, the Spanish sent over a general by the name of Weyler. And General Weyler was known by American newspapers, anyways, as the Butcher, because he came in and he really lowered the boom on the Cuban people. I mean, he put civilians into these things he called reconcentration camps, which basically, what that means is these civilians are being held hostage, and so that the rebels will stop fighting. You know, they'll hopefully give up because they know their family members are being held in these disease-ridden camps where people are starving. I mean, just really, really brutal images come out of Cuba of the Spanish treatment of the Cuban people. Now, really playing up the brutality in Cuba is something we know as yellow journalism. So yellow journalism is where basically journalists, they focus on sensationalism, stories that catch people's eyes because they're dramatic, sometimes violent, gory, the kind of stuff that you would see like, on a comic book cover or something. It's really like it's designed to get your attention so you'll buy those newspapers. And two newspaper men in particular, Hearst and Pulitzer, are really trying to outdo each other by having more and more sensational stories put into their newspapers so that people will buy them. So this isn't really about necessarily helping the Cuban people. It's more about helping these journalists make money off of the Cuban suffering. Famously, Hearst sent an artist named Remington down to Cuba to draw some of these really sensationalist pictures of, for example, a woman being searched, an American woman being searched by Spanish officials. And he famously said, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war," right? Because war will sell a lot of newspapers. Now, America was interested in trying to keep a lid on the problems in Cuba, and they're trying to get Spain to behave. They also want to protect Americans in case another war were to break out in Cuba. And so it was decided to send an American battleship down to Havana, the capital city of Cuba. It's called the USS Maine. And what happens is on February 15th, 1898, the Maine unexpectedly blows up. 260 American sailors are dead, and Americans are furious. We immediately blame the Spanish. We claim that they had planted a bomb under the ship or something nefarious like this. The Spanish, for their parts, they pled not guilty, in the sense that they assured us they had nothing to do with this. But we weren't interested in that. Now, later in the 1970s, forensics experts looked at all the evidence and they came to the conclusion that this was almost guaranteed not a Spanish explosive, that it probably was actually an internal explosion, an accident, in other words. So Americans accidentally blew up their own battleship. But in 1898, we're not interested in that stuff. What we want revenge. We want the Spanish to pay for this thing we see as this horrible crime. And "Remember the Maine" was the slogan that Americans chanted. We want to remember the Maine by getting revenge on the Spanish. And you can see in this cartoon the Spanish are being depicted as some sort of monsters. You can see how they've murdered these American sailors, and they're standing on American flags, and just, over the top. Now, McKinley, our president at the time, was in a bit of a dilemma. He doesn't really want a war. He doesn't want to rush into something like that. But he also doesn't want Spain to hold on to Cuba because Spain has done such a lousy job of ruling Cuba, especially in recent years, and it's only going to continue to be a problem if Spain continues to own Cuba. But he's also under the impression that Cuba is not really ready for independence. They're not really ready to rule themselves. So what do we do? So McKinley really wants to try to find some sort of, third path short of war. The problem for him, he's a politician, and politically it's becoming very hard to not join with the let's go to war crowd. So eventually he is forced to basically cave in and ask Congress to declare war. He's under, as I said, intense public pressure for revenge. He knows he's going to be up for re-election in 2 years in 1900, and he doesn't want to look weak. He doesn't believe the Spanish. He thinks the Spanish were involved somehow, perhaps, or he at least doesn't believe that they'll treat the Cubans any better going forward. And finally, America's interests, both strategic and economics, in Cuba were just too high to kind of just let continue to go the way it had in the past. Something had to change. So Congress declares war on Spain on April 11th, 1898, and attached to this declaration of war something called the Teller Amendment. And what the Teller Amendment said is, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically that the Spanish-American War was not a war for America to conquer Cuba. The Spanish-American War was a war to help free the Cubans from Spanish control. So we're not there to take over Cuba. We're there to help them get their independence. Now, at the same time we're focused on Cuba, there's also a thought about, well, what do we do about the Philippines? So the Philippines was this very large Spanish colony in Asia, right next door to China. I mean, this could be very good for American trade. This would complement Hawaii if we can get our hands on Hawaii as well. And so the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time was a guy named Theodore Roosevelt. And Roosevelt didn't wait around for a declaration of war. What he did, and I find this pretty amazing, his boss, the Secretary of the Navy, was basically taking a leave of absence, kind of like going on vacation, basically. And so Roosevelt was in charge of running the Naval Department. And he, kept reassuring his boss, oh, you don't need to come back to Washington. War's probably not going to happen. Don't worry about it. Meanwhile, and again, this is weeks before war is declared, Theodore Roosevelt orders the Navy to prepare to go attack the Philippines if war is declared. So basically, the second war is declared, the Navy can rush out there and take down the Philippines from Spain. Now, the Philippines are literally on the other side of the globe from Cuba. It has nothing to do with the Cuban Revolution or anything. It's really just a target of opportunity. And there is Teddy Roosevelt. The thing about Roosevelt, and I'm a big Teddy Roosevelt fan, but he is a guy who likes war way more than you should. And in fact, there had been other incidences in recent American history at this point where America might have had to go to war, but it avoided it. And every time Teddy Roosevelt was disappointed. He wanted a war. He wanted to go to war and, basically achieve some glory. So on May 1st, 1898, Commodore George Dewey, his American fleet sweeps in and destroys the Spanish fleet in Manila. Manila, again, capital city of the Philippines. Now, this battle went about as well as it could. Not a single American died in combat in this battle, even though the Spanish fleet was sunk. In fact, only one person died in the battle from the American side. He died of a heart attack. Had nothing to do with fighting. Now, the Navy is great for knocking out Spanish ships, but it's not so good at taking over the Philippines. You can't exactly take battleships on land. So, the naval forces are going to coordinate their efforts with a guy named Emilio Aguinaldo. So Aguinaldo was a Philippine nationalist rebel who had been basically kicked out of the Philippines by Spain, and we're going to return him from exile back to the Philippines to kind of oversee the Spanish, or excuse me, the Filipino guerrillas assert control and take over the Philippines from Spanish control. We will come back and revisit this whole idea of Emilio Aguinaldo that we brought back to Philippines later. It's going to come back to haunt us. All right, meanwhile, in Cuba, what can we do down there? Well, the plan was to land some American forces here. Let me go back to the map. So our plan is to land some American forces down here, pretty far away from Havana. Our goal from this really is not to take over the whole island. Rather, we're trying to destroy the Spanish fleet. And the Spanish fleet is bottled up in the port city right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to land American forces here, and that will force the Spanish to withdraw their fleet out to sea, where then we can destroy it with our fleet. So there's only a couple of actual land battles in this war. It's over very, very quickly. But right here on these hills, we create a war hero out of Theodore Roosevelt. So what happened is after Roosevelt ordered the Navy to go attack Manila, he basically resigns from the Assistant Secretaryship of the Navy. He organizes, along with a guy named Leonard Wood, this regiment of volunteers. They called themselves the Rough Riders. It was a mixture of cowboys Roosevelt had met in his time out in the Dakotas as a rancher, businessmen and aristocrats from the East who knew Roosevelt from, his days in the Ivy League and all that. It's just a really colorful mix of guys, and they're all going to go down there and fight under Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt, by the way, is 40 years old at this time, and maybe a little past his time as a soldier on the front lines, but he performs very bravely. And on Kettle Hill, the Rough Riders, along with two black regiments of American soldiers, charge up under intense Spanish fire, and Roosevelt becomes a national hero. Part of this was personal. His father was a military agent in the Civil War, but had chosen to hire a substitute to fight in his place and didn't fight in the Civil War. And that was something that Teddy Roosevelt frankly was ashamed about, and he felt like he had to make up for his father's failing by proving the Roosevelt name in battle, and he did it in the Spanish-American War. All right, now at the same time, Cuba is being, is really the main focus of this, and we're also fighting over in the Philippines. Americans invade Puerto Rico, which is next door to Cuba, another Spanish colony, and that is taken before the war ends. So if you ever wondered why Puerto Rico is part of America, this is why, the Spanish-American War. So now America has itself an empire, and this is the product of the Treaty of Paris of 1898. Yes, another Treaty of Paris. I know, it's hard to believe. So the details in this treaty is that Cuba will be freed from Spain. Remember, America is not going to take Cuba. That was part of the Teller Amendment. We're not going to do that. But we are going to take Guam and Puerto Rico from Spain. Now, as far as the Philippines, that was a much more difficult question. What do we actually do about the Philippines? So this is where McKinley once again finds himself in a bit of a dilemma as president. Much like Cuba, he didn't really want to take the Philippines as an American possession, but he was also very skeptical that the Filipinos could rule themselves. This is social Darwinism and paternalism and all that. He just didn't see the Filipinos as ready to be independent. But he was also afraid another big power like, say, Japan might roll in and take the Philippines. So he's just not sure what to do. He's getting a lot of pressure from missionaries. They want to go in there and spread Protestant faith because the Philippines was largely Catholic. He's also getting a lot of pressure from business leaders thinking they can make a lot of money in the Philippines. And he's just not sure what to do. Now, the way McKinley tells it is he was basically one night pacing the halls of the White House, just couldn't sleep because he's wrestling with this. What do we do with the Philippines? What do we do? And his story is that basically God spoke to him and told him that they had to take over the Philippines, that we just had no choice but to take the Philippines, educate the Filipinos, and Christianize them. And after that, he said, he went to bed and slept peacefully. Now, to take the Philippines, though, and all those other possessions like Puerto Rico and Guam, we're going to give the Spanish $20 million. Okay. So there is McKinley, and you can see he has got Cuba back here, Puerto Rico, and then the Philippines. And we're washing the Philippines in education and civilization. Okay, this is really the definition, visual definition of paternalism, right? Seeing non-Westerners as nothing more than kids needing advice and guidance and wisdom. Here's America. This is Colombia. She's basically like the female Uncle Sam, and she's proud of her new hat as a world power. And speaking of Uncle Sam, there he is shouting or screaming or something. He's pretty happy that we just won this great war. Now remember, there was a lot of people who were frankly skeptical about this whole imperialism thing, and there were members of Congress who, the Senate, who didn't want anything to do with this treaty, and it passes by a single vote. So it tells us there was a lot of opposition to this acquiring of territory. Now, I told you about the Teller Amendment, where we claimed we're not going to take over Cuba, we're just here to help the Cubans. Well, as soon as Cuba is independent and they start drawing up a constitution, we basically insist very strongly that Cuba include in their constitution something called the Platt Amendment. And what this does is it puts some big limits on Cuban independence. America reserves the right to intervene as we see fit in Cuban affairs. We can even invade and change their government out if we don't feel it's the right one for Cuba or for us. And we also require Cuba to give us a little bit of territory. So while we're not going to take all of Cuba, we are going to take a little piece right down here, Guantanamo Naval Base, which we still own in the modern day, present day. This is still an American naval base, even though we and Cuba are not exactly best friends. So this is an example of America living up to our promise that we're not going to take over Cuba, but not really living up to our promise, because the limit we place on Cuba makes it not quite really independent. It's basically a puppet of the United States going forward. All right, back to the Philippines. So if you remember, the Filipinos had been rebelling way before we even got to the Philippines. They didn't want to be part of the Spanish Empire. We had basically helped them kick the Spanish out, and then we decided to take over the Philippines. Those Filipino rebels, they're not happy about that, right? Emilio Aguinaldo, he's like, hey, you know what? We were busy shooting at Spanish. Now we'll just shoot at Americans. You know, we'll just keep this rebellion going under our new leaders. And so that person we brought back to the Philippines to help us is going to lead a war against our soldiers. And what we find ourselves in is a really difficult position, because the Spanish-American War went so quickly, so easily, with so little loss of life. It was almost just like we couldn't believe it. And then we find ourselves stuck in this problem in the Philippines, where a rebellion breaks out and lasts for years. Over 100,000 American soldiers are sent there to try to put down the rebellion. It's very expensive. Atrocities are committed on both sides. It just turns into an absolute mess. And again, it's called the Philippine Insurrection. Insurrection, just a fancy word for rebellion. Now, in the end, despite the fact that the rebels, were on home soil and all that, they just don't have the modern weaponry Americans do. And when Emilio Aguinaldo, the rebel leader, was captured in 1901, it really takes just a big, it just takes a lot of the air out of the balloon of the rebellion, and eventually it fizzles out by 1902. And when all is said and done, some 4,000 Americans are dead, and we think as many as 220,000 Filipino civilians are dead. So the Philippine insurrection, way more costly than the war we fought to gain the Philippines, the Spanish-American War. By the way, the future first American governor of the Philippines was a guy named William Howard Taft, who will later become president and then later after that become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was also a very close friend of Theodore Roosevelt. All right, guys, I know this is a lot of stuff, but we have one more topic to cover. This is going to be the Panama Canal, and this is a topic I know you've learned about in the past. The Panama Canal was built largely because, of the need to avoid having to go all the way around South America. That's a long, long journey. If you can go through here, you're going to save yourself a ton of time and money. Now, why would we want a canal for ourselves? Well, this will help us maneuver our Navy around more quickly because, after all, we have two coastlines to deal with, to protect, and so now with the Panama Canal we can move the Navy back and forth very quickly between the two oceans. This will help us defend our new territories that we've gained from this war, like Cuba, like Guantanamo Bay, and Puerto Rico and Guam and the Philippines, and this will help increase trade because it's just so much more efficient. The problem with all this is that Panama at the time was not an independent nation. It was actually part of the country of Colombia. So we offer up this deal to Colombia. We say, okay, listen, we want to buy a 6-mile wide strip of land across the Isthmus of Panama. We will give you $10 million and annual payments of $250,000. The Colombians turned down what we see as a very generous offer. And that, makes us start thinking, okay, what's plan B? How can we get our hand on that land if Colombia is not willing to sell it? Well, this is where things get a little kind of unclear as exactly what happened. It's a little kind of smoky, a little cloudy is what happened. Down in Panama, there were people who wanted to rebel against Colombia. They wanted independence. They didn't want to be ruled by Colombia any longer. And into this situation comes a guy from France by the last name of Bonaventure. And Bonaventure was, he's not really working for the French government. He's kind of just like this lone ranger, out there. And he helps incite a rebellion in Panama against Colombia. America is overjoyed by this. And the American Navy is sent down there to put pressure on Colombia to not send troops in to put down this uprising. So basically, we are going to not allow Colombia to put down the rebellion in Panama. The rebellion was over in just 3 days, and Panama we quickly recognized as an independent nation. Now, this was seen as a little kind of shady that America had possibly helped stir up a revolution in Panama so that Panama would break away from Colombia. And that shadiness is really the subject of this political cartoon. You've got Teddy Roosevelt here. He's dumping the dirt as he's digging the canal onto Bogota, which is the capital city of Colombia. Now, what comes out of this rebellion is something called the Hay-Bonaventure Treaty. Hay was reference to America's Secretary of State at the time, and Bonaventure was that French agent we just talked about. And this was signed November of 1903. The $10 million and the $250,000 every year stays the same, but this time we're paying the Panamanians, not the Colombians, and the Panamanians are willing to give us a 10-mile wide strip of land instead of a 6-mile wide strip of land. So this is where the Panama Canal will be built. It's called the Canal Zone. This becomes American territory. It's like a tiny little colony right there in the middle of Panama. Now, helping us build this canal is the fact that the French had already tried this. They had spent years trying to dig a Panama Canal before the company doing it went out of basically went into bankruptcy, and many of the workers died from disease. So we're kind of finishing the work, basically, that the French had already started. This is a reference to the shadiness, the intrigue that we just talked about, how maybe we had kind of gotten Panama to break away from Colombia with the help of this shady French guy, Bonaventure. And because of the circumstances of our acquisition of this land, some Americans felt kind of guilty about it. And in the 1970s, we agreed to return the canal zone to the Panamanians. So we do not own the Panama Canal any longer. It's been returned to Panama. Here's Teddy Roosevelt going down there to check out the construction. It takes about 10 years to build this canal. It was finished just in time for World War I. It was an incredibly expensive project, one of the great infrastructure projects in all of history. But, you know, it's going to make back money easily through tolls and just increased efficiency. By the way, when Teddy Roosevelt went down there to check on the progress of the work and kind of get a tour of the Panama Canal dig zone, he was the first American president to leave America, while in office. No American president ever left the confines of America while being president before. All right, now we're going to look at this thing called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So if you recall, the Monroe Doctrine was basically our message to European countries to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. You're not welcome here. We don't want you building colonies here anymore. It's our neck of the woods. Stay out. So what Teddy Roosevelt does is he adds to that Monroe Doctrine. That's what corollary means. It's like an extension of an existing idea. So the Roosevelt corollary is basically the Monroe Doctrine 2.0. And what this states is that Teddy Roosevelt believes in something called preventive intervention. What he means by that is that we reserve the right to intervene in the affairs of Latin American countries to prevent them from falling into the hands of European conquerors. We don't want Germans or Brits or French or anybody else coming over here and taking over colonies or building colonies in these countries. We're not going to let that happen. So to keep these countries stable so they don't fall into that, we believe we have the right to intervene as we see fit. Now, to get the Europeans to take us seriously, of course, we're going to have a good Navy. And Roosevelt's going to spend a lot of money building up the Navy, and in fact, actually sending it out on a little tour of the world. It was called the Great White Fleet, and he sent it literally around the world to show it off to the other countries. Now, this idea of ours just kind of, deciding we can intervene when we feel like it in the Caribbean and in Central America, this was not something that endeared us to those people. They saw us as the Colossus of the North, this big, lumbering giant of a country who tends to sometimes interfere in their activities and in what they see as an unwelcomed way. And in fact, let me show you the map. We are going to interfere a lot, right? You can see the years of American interventions in Mexico, Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, the Canal Zone, Nicaragua, Panama. I mean, we really got involved in a lot of these areas, and as we did so, we made a lot of enemies. Okay, I realized that was a lot of stuff, guys, and I apologize it was so much, but the Spanish-American War, it turns out, was very important and very detailed. So make sure you know why the Spanish-American War happened, and know the effects. Know what areas we gained as a result of the Treaty of Paris, and then also what were the effects of gaining that land. More imperialism, right? We're going to gain the Canal Zone. We're going to have to fight a rebellion in the Philippines and so forth. All right, that is it for imperialism. We will move on and look at something else in period 7 in our next video.